In this episode, we'll discuss with Chris Daw QC his new book, Justice on Trial, Radical Solutions for a System at Breaking Point, which has recently been released and has almost instantly hit a #1 best-selling book on Amazon. Chris has been a criminal defence lawyer for over 25 years and was made Queen's Counsel in 2013. So thank you, Chris, for joining us.
You're welcome. It's great to speak to you on this boiling hot summer's day.
Perfect. Well, so just
Good
after
to talk
reading
law in the sunshine.
Yeah, so after reading this book, I definitely recommend it to everyone listening. Chris does a fantastic job of explaining complex criminal justice processes and why he believes they don't work in a very simple and concise way through the use of real life experience examples, strategically placed statistics, and by explaining the history of various justice systems to give you an idea of where we started and where we are today. So here we'll discuss Chris's support for the abolishment of prisons and the legalisation of drugs, policies which definitely earn the title of radical solutions. Within the book, you lay out a clear plan, policies which you think would radically reform the criminal justice system for the better. So have you ever thought about, getting into politics so you can actually make the changes that you think our country needs in our justice system?
I thought about getting into politics when I was like 16, 17, maybe through to my university days when I was kind of a bit of a student politician. But once I got a real job as a lawyer, I kind of realized that politics it's just too frustrating. It's too hard to achieve change. So I had no desire to become an MP or to have to deal with all of that stuff. I think I could be more useful to the process as a sort of outsider, as an expert, if you like, as an expert witness, and also as a communicator. Through the book, through the writing that I do, or through the television programs that I've made, I've got the opportunity to make the arguments and just get them out there and get people talking about things. And hopefully some of that will enter into the public debate and into the political debate, and eventually we'll see some change. But the short answer is, no time soon am I planning to become an MP. But if they want me in the House of Lords, I might say yes. You never know.
Yeah. So one of the reviews on the back of your book is from Cherry Blair QC.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, as Tony Blair's wife.
Correct.
So, yeah. So have you spoken to any high-profile politicians about your ideas? And if you have,
I have had conversations. I'm not going to sort of say who with, but I've had conversations with a number of politicians from different parties and opinion formers and think tanks and so on. And there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of engagement. And I think people are starting to realise now, as we come out of the whole COVID crisis and we realise we've got no money left, that we need to think carefully about whether we can carry on just spending money as we do on criminal justice and achieving nothing. Because most of what we spend on criminal justice is you may as well flush the money down the toilet. And we don't have money to flush down the toilet. So I think there is interest, there is engagement, but whether it will filter up far enough to get things done, so in other words, whether the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, I'm not optimistic, because both of them have previously expressed really quite retrograde ideas about crime and punishment, and the same old rhetoric about getting tough. So I think people are listening from across the political spectrum, but whether or not anyone in power does anything about it, I think that's a much more difficult question and much harder to. I'm quite sceptical, frankly, about that.
So we'll speak about the whole getting on tough mantra later on in the discussion. You start off the chapter on the legalisation of drugs by quoting Mark Renton from Trainspotting, where he says, "Streets are awash with drugs you can have for unhappiness and pain, and we took them all." So, he references unhappiness and pain as reasons, maybe he took drugs. So what do you think reasons are for high drug abuse rates in this country, and in particular Scotland?
I think there's only one reason why we have such high drug abuse rates, and it's because the drugs are prohibited and illegal. Before drugs were prohibited in Britain in the way that they are now, by the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, which applies in Scotland as well, of course. But before that happened, there were very low levels of serious heroin abuse, for example, and even low levels of cocaine abuse. And we had, 1,000, maybe 2,000 long-term problem heroin users. And they got their heroin from their doctor, and it was prescription model, so there were no drug dealers dealing it. But then we prohibited drugs really quite, in an extreme way by the 1971 Act. And within a decade, we had hundreds of thousands of heroin users, hundreds of thousands of heroin addicts. We had thousands of drug overdoses, as we still do now, particularly, as you say, in Scotland. There are very high levels of overdose in Scotland, one of the highest in Europe. And that the only reason for that is because of drug prohibition. I mean, as you know, I travelled all over the place for the book, and one of the places I visited was Geneva, where in Switzerland they've had heroin-assisted treatment programs for 20 or 25 years, and the results are quite spectacular. They have virtually no overdoses. The drug users are in much better health than the drug users are in England and Scotland, and the levels of drug-related crime are virtually nil. So you know, I think we're in a situation where prohibition is the single most important cause of drug deaths, drug crime, and the misery around addiction. And that's the most important thing we can change in the system to try to reverse things and make it a better society, but one where there's less crime. Because the whole of my book is about how to reduce crime. And that's what everybody wants. That's the point of criminal justice, surely. But at the moment, we don't think about reducing crime. We just think about lock them up, punish people. And that applies to drugs as much as anything else. And I think we've gone drastically wrong on drug policy for at least 50 years.
You know, I think a lot of people may not understand how, you know, drug use was at a lower level when they were readily available and legal, but when they were prohibited and made illegal, you know, the use, you know, exploded. So do you think it's because the fact that they're legal makes it more attractive, or are there any other?
No, it wasn't so much that they were readily available and they weren't legal in the sense that anybody could sell heroin. You had to go to a doctor or a licensed, you know, prescriber to get heroin. And under a regulated system, you would have to go to regulated premises. I'm not suggesting that you should be allowed to sell heroin on the streets, you know, as part of an unregulated market. But the real reason why heroin use proliferated after prohibition was because there became a profit element to it. And as soon as there's profit to be made from something, dealers will step in and they will make profit from it. When there was no profit to be made, because anyone that wanted to use heroin could go and get it effectively for free from the doctor, then dealers weren't interested. But once it became an illegal market, that meant there was huge profit. And when there's huge profit, what happens is dealers go out there and they sell heroin to people like any other business. They want to sell as much heroin to as many people as possible. They're called drug pushers for a reason, because they push drugs on people. And then when people are hooked, they have no choice. They keep going back and back. So it's just a direct and fairly logical consequence of prohibition. You've created an illegal market. You've created massive profit margins. Someone's going to step in and supply that demand, and someone is going to push the drugs onto people in an aggressive and proactive way that doesn't happen in a regulated market, or shouldn't happen in a regulated market.
So on the topic of drug pushers and the like, you wrote in the book that the British National Crime Agency is clear that drug trafficking is the largest source of revenue for organised crime groups, many of which are involved in other forms of serious crimes such as firearm dealing, sexual exploitation, modern slavery and illegal immigration. With your support for the legalisation of drugs, do you also believe that we should legalise prostitution and guns and other forms?
No, definitely not guns. That would be insanity. I mean, they have obviously a large number of legally held firearms in the United States, and that's led to a vast number of shooting deaths, tens and tens of thousands of shooting deaths in both murder and suicide a year in the US, and enormous levels of gun violence. So I wouldn't advocate the legalization of guns in this country by any means. But yes, I absolutely believe that prostitution. See, there's a similarity between the drug trade, as you know, and prostitution. Or sex work, as I think is the way that people, the term that people use now. But the similarity is that the two things have always been there. There has always been sex work, there's always been prostitution in human society for thousands and thousands of years. It's never gone away, and it never will. And likewise, there has always been the use of intoxicants in human society. As you know, in the book, I go back 200 million years and talk about, you know, the evolution of the modern human alongside psychoactive plants, which when there's the DNA and the carbon dating record and the analysis that's available shows that there was a close association between, you know, pre kind of modern humans and drugs, and all through human societies since the Mayan civilizations through to the Romans and the Greeks, and all ever since there's been the use of psychotropic and psychoactive substances. So they are similar, and when something will never disappear, the only rational thing to do is to license it, legalize it, and regulate it. And then you get tax revenue from it. But most importantly of all, you keep people safe. So sex workers are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. They're exposed to very high levels of violence. They are often themselves suffering from mental health problems or addictions. And if you throw them out of society and you call them criminals because they're involved in that trade, you make their lives immeasurably worse, and you make their health worse, and you make other people's health worse, because of course in a regulated, and many countries around the world have regulated sex work, and the women and men who are involved in that industry, they have regular health checks, they are screened for HIV, they're screened for hepatitis, they are, they have a range of health measures which preserve their own health and preserve the health of customers. Whereas in our country, we still criminalise sex work, and often sex workers as a result are extremely in poor health and very much abused, and they're open to the influence and control of pimps in a way that doesn't happen in a regulated and licensed market. So absolutely, but not guns. No, you wouldn't. I mean, the American model is sheer insanity, and it's based on this ridiculous interpretation of the Constitution that doesn't make any sense to anyone, and it leads to countless lives being lost a year. And I would go nowhere near the legalisation of guns.
So, referencing the use of drugs in the Victorian era, you wrote, when it came to the use of drugs of whatever description, what went on behind closed doors, particularly in the homes of the upper class, attracted little reprehension at all. That is not surprising, given the lead from the top. For as many historians have noted, Queen Victoria herself, surely the embodiment of proper behaviour and etiquette, really liked taking drugs. And I think you go on to say that she took cocaine via chewing gum with Winston Churchill before he was the Prime Minister, which many people may not know.
He was quite young, yeah, obviously, yeah.
Yeah. So consider.
Yeah, he took his chewing gum laced with cocaine, which was the favoured way of taking it back in that time. And he took it up to see the Queen, and they had a chomp on a bit of cocaine together, and I'm sure they had a long, happy conversation and had plenty to say for themselves, as most people taking cocaine tend to do. But the point is that was an era of great moral kind of control and restriction. Things like the length of skirts were very, heavily controlled, and all of that kind of thing. But when it came to the consumption of morphine or opium or cocaine or even cannabis, as I also talk about in the book, the upper classes were completely fine with that, and it wasn't criminal, let alone something that was morally reprehensible. It was just no different to having a glass of wine or a glass of port after dinner or whatever. And so it's only, as I say, it really was. And the book, I think, probably will surprise some people when they see that there really wasn't any negativity around the taking of drugs in the moral sense, really until the early 20th century, when the American kind of movement started towards prohibition. Of course, they had a prohibition of alcohol for a while in the US as well. And then the Americans really pushed everybody to start prohibiting drugs in the late 60s, early 70s. And we in Britain went along with it. We passed the Misuse of Drugs Act, and we've been making the same mistake about drug policy ever since. We've created a society where drug users are pariahs, where drug dealers are locked up for decades, if not for the rest of their life, and where the consequence of that is many, many young people killed on the streets from gun crime and knife crime, and many, many users dying in alleyways from overdoses because of the nature of the product they take. And of course, billions of pounds going into the hands of organised criminals so that they can fund other really depraved criminal acts like people trafficking, human trafficking, and child sexual exploitation, which is where the attention of the law enforcement authorities should really be. That's where the concentration should be. How do we protect children from sexual exploitation? If we spent a third of the amount we spent on drug prohibition and drug enforcement on that, we'd probably solved it overnight. But instead, we mount these long-term surveillance operations. We send drug dealers to prison, as I say, for decades. We spend billions a year on drug prohibition enforcement activity, and we achieve absolutely nothing by doing it.
Yeah, no, I was surprised reading that Winston Churchill and Queen Victoria, engaged in those activities. But in the modern context, so with many at the top of the UK's political system, found out that they took drugs. For example, Michael Gove. Do you think the middle class?
Half the cabinet, I think. Half the cabinet, wasn't it? Before the election, it came clean and admitted that I admitted. I mean, I don't think it's any great shame, but they admitted it. But they, of course, all made excuses and said they didn't. The whole Bill Clinton, I didn't inhale, and all this rubbish. Instead of just saying, look, we did it. So how can we possibly be such hypocrites that we're going to stop everybody else doing it?
So you said you maybe would have government outlets which sell these drugs in a regulated and taxed fashion. So do you not think that having such a regulated and taxed system would, would not get rid of the drug dealers, because they maybe provide cheaper products, they may be more willing to sell to people underage, and then bring them in through that way? So do you not think that there may be an issue in that
Well,
department?
we don't really have a big issue with that in the alcohol market. We have a very small market for illegally produced alcohol, and as far as alcohol being sold to underage people, of course that happens, and of course that's always happened. But the difference is that what is sold to underage people is a product of known quantity and quality. So we know if someone underage gets a bottle of wine or a bottle of beer or whatever it is, they know what's in it, and everyone knows what's in it, and they may drink too much of it, and they may make themselves ill by drinking too much of it. But unlike Martha Fernbach, whose story I tell in the book, who was a 15-year-old who went out and took some MDMA with her friends, she had no idea what she was taking, because it came in a little, polystyrene or plastic packet with no label, no percentage, no nothing. And it turned out that she'd taken 91% pure MDMA, and enough of it to kill a horse. And she had no idea. Now, that can't happen if you go out and buy a bottle of whiskey. You know what's in it. And sadly, some children still do choose to drink way too much. And sadly, some will even die from it. But it's much harder to die from alcohol poisoning when you know what's in the alcohol than it is to die from a drug overdose when you have no idea what you're putting in your mouth, or in your vein for that matter. So I think the other point you made about would there still be the illegal market because they could undercut the price? Well, you couldn't allow that to happen, because in a regulated market, you would have to set the price at a level that made it impossible for a dealer to make a profit. And don't forget, governments can produce drugs at a much lower cost than illegal dealer networks, because governments, of course, can, we produce pharmaceutical heroin as it is, and it costs next to nothing. It's not an expensive thing to make. Whereas dealers have to buy it on the black market and import it through the different layers. And by the time you go from a market in Afghanistan at a kilo of pure heroin is $2,000 or $3,000, by the time it's in veins in the UK, it's 100,000. It's been cut, it's been transported, it's been sold and resold. Well, users will be getting their pure pharmaceutical heroin from a regulated supplier, as they do in Switzerland, through the clinic system. And they'd have absolutely no need or motivation to go and buy impure heroin at what would be a higher price from a dealer. And I'm not saying there'll be no illegal market, just as there is at least some residual illegal market for alcohol. But it would be a tiny fraction of what it is now. And I think over time it would gradually disappear as being uneconomic.
So you just referred there to somebody you wrote about in your book, a young girl who took drugs and died from that. So do you think that there is a problem with drug use among young people, especially in schools?
I think there's a problem in a prohibited market, because, as you say, dealers will sell to anyone. They don't care how old the customer is. They don't, no one's going to inspect them. No one's taking away their license. So they don't care who they sell to. They want to sell to anyone that will buy the product. And I do. I talk in schools, and I know that drugs are out there. Drugs are everywhere. This is one of the points. Everybody talks about drug taking being amoral or immoral or whatever word you choose, but it's happening now in our society, and it's killing people. So if drug taking is killing people, and killing young children in particular, like Martha, a lovely young girl who just made a mistake, but made a mistake because of prohibition. So if people really want to stop drug taking having its worst effects on young people, then they need to look at a license model rather than the current free-for-all, where the only people that really support the current system, who have any sense and are using evidence to base their opinion, are drug dealers. Drug dealers love prohibition, because without it, they'd have no business. So, if you think about it from that point of view, why do people who want to be tough on crime, you're in the same camp as drug dealers? Because they want you to be as tough as possible, because the tougher you are, the higher the price goes up. And the higher the price, the more profit there is. So, if people want to kind of moralize about drugs, go for it. But then you look Anne-Marie, Martha's mother, look her in the face, because she's a strong advocate now of legalization and licensing. She believes her daughter would be alive if Martha had been able to get MDMA where she knew that it wasn't 91% pure and she knew it wouldn't kill her. She'd still be alive today. So look her in the eye and say, we support this system of prohibition that killed your daughter. And if you can do that, then, you know, and you can sleep at night, then you've got justification perhaps in your position, but it's still wrong.
I think you made some persuasive arguments about why you think that we should legalise drugs. But just to move on to prison reform and your views on prison reform as well. So the second chapter of the book is entitled Why We Should Close All Prisons. So this may seem like a shocking proposal to many. So could you explain your preferred alternative?
One of the things that I tried to do with the book, as you know, each of the chapters has a fairly controversial chapter name. You know, why we should legalize drugs, why we should close all prisons, why children are never criminals. You know, these are kind of very powerful, kind of simple statements of principle. And the reason I've adopted that approach in relation to prisons is because I was trying to put forward a counter narrative to the oft-repeated phrase, lock them up and throw away the key. And that's the opposite, if you like, of closing all prisons. So what I was trying to do was say, okay, that's the current kind of mindset that guides policy, is the lock them up, throw away the key mentality, and that's been the case election after election, and, you know, government after government. So what's the opposite? The opposite is close them all down. So there won't even be any keys. Now, what I'm not saying is that you know, tomorrow morning someone just takes a bulldozer and bulldozes every prison and lets everybody out, because that's clearly ridiculous. What I'm saying is that you look at the prisons that are the worst, that have the worst outcomes, the worst conditions, the worst recidivism rates, and the recidivism rates for prisons are so high anyway, but the worst ones, and you shut those down. And in their place, you build prisons which are rehabilitation communities that are focused only on what happens the day the person is released, not on what happens while they're kind of in prison and how long they're in prison. But how do we make sure when they come out, they've got somewhere to live, they've got a job, they can exist and pay taxes, they can look after their kids. At the moment, none of that happens. So they come out of prison, blinking in the sunlight, you know, shocked to the system. They've got nowhere to live, no contact, no connections with reality. And so usually within days, if not days, weeks, many people who have come out of prison are committing more crime and they're getting locked up again. So I'm suggesting that we gradually unwind the history of the last 200 years, close down all of the Victorian prisons, all of the prisons that are built in that model, where the big high walls and the barbed wire, and you focus prison only on the 31% of people in the prison estate who are in there for violent crimes, and the rest of them you deal with in the community using electronic surveillance and fingerprint recognition, you know, all the other technologies, facial recognition that we've got them all built into our phones. You can monitor people, they can have contact with their probation officers or judges or whoever's their drug workers over the type of system that we're using now, using Zoom or whatever. And so that's the sort of nearly 70% who are non-violent, but only really the most violent rapists and murderers and people who have committed really shocking acts of violence and are dangerous day to day. They need to be in secure conditions. But in other words, they need to have a fence around the place and they can't escape. But apart from that, they too need to be treated with respect, and they need to be rehabilitated so that when they come out, they won't just go out and commit another violent act, because at the moment, that's what they're more likely than not to do. And that's why the prison system is so wrong, because we're letting people back out onto the streets. We're doing nothing while they're in prison other than reinforcing their criminal behavior and making them more violent. And that creates more victims. And that, to me, is the biggest tragedy of all.
So in regards to the United States, you're right, the fifth largest city, the most powerful country on earth, is the United States prison system. So what is it about the US's criminal justice system that's led to so many people being incarcerated? And do you think that there are any mistakes the United States has made that we yet haven't, that we can learn from?
I think they have made many mistakes. I think the genesis of a lot of their kind of issues, and as you say, I describe the US prison system as the city of incarceration. You know, it's 2.3 million people in prison in the US, and a huge proportion of young black men from urban areas in prison at any one time. And I think there is an element of racism in the origins of that. I think there was, for a long time, young black men were treated, and we see what's happened. You know, we see the recent Black Lives Matter protests and the deaths in police hands and in police custody in the US. So we see that that's still playing out now. So I think there's a racist element to it. But when I traveled around the States, I was amazed at just how many people in the system, including those who were like judges, who were sitting and imposing imposing death sentences and so on. But I was amazed at how many of the people in the system acknowledged that it was fundamentally broken, and it was fundamentally counterproductive and causing much more violence than there needed to be. So their mistake has been, and it's a mistake of proportion. So we do the same things. We still get politicians who believe that cracking down and increasing sentences is a good idea, but America just took that to a whole new level. And they largely target, I mean, they have hundreds of thousands in prison for drug crimes. They have many hundreds of thousands in prison for violations of parole or not paying fines and so on. So the American addiction to prison is something that we already have. We just don't have it quite as bad yet. And if we can press the brake pedal, reverse, and go back to the prison populations we had 20 or 30 years ago, because we doubled in that time our prison population, well, then we can avoid the car crash that would be the American system. If we ended up with a pro rata number of prisoners, it would be almost 500,000. And we've got 80,000. We've got 80,000 now. And we have the highest rate of incarceration in Europe with 80,000. If we had the same proportion in America, it's nearly 500,000. And that would be a society that would be a shocking place to live, that had 500,000 people in prison at any one time. And that's, in a country the size of Britain. Anyone that's ever been to an American prison will tell you the same as I've described in the book. That it's a dystopia. It's horrific, and they are awful places. And no one in their right mind would send anybody there and expect them to come out and do anything other than carry on committing crime, because they're just conditioned to be criminals in such places. So we can avoid that. Our system's not as quite as bad as the American system, but we'll see. I mean, the direction of travel is not good.
Later on you describe, you explain that naturally the wealthy and the nobility of Rome tended to avoid punishment, even for the most serious of crimes, while slaves were almost always crucified. Do you think that the wealthy can still avoid punishment while working class people are penalised more harshly? And if so, how would you have the justice system deal with this economic inequality, which arguably infringes upon the principle of equality before the law?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's no doubt. I mean, I act for almost entirely for privately funded clients who are usually quite well funded, and their access to defence is, hugely advantageous in comparison to those who have no money and rely on legal aid. But the reason why the difference is so great now is not because there's anything in principle wrong with people who can afford it paying for their own defence, because they always can. You can't stop them. But what the problem is caused by the fact that legal aid has been cut so much in the last 20 to 30 years, to the point that it's almost uneconomic for lawyers to do the work at all. And if you cut something that much, you're just going to create disparity and unfairness in the system, which you need to avoid. So the answer is you need to invest in restoring legal aid expenditure and legal aid provision, so that there is only a minor or minuscule difference in outcomes, whether someone is legally aided or whether they are privately funded. And I guess, many people have faults with the NHS, but broadly speaking, people would say that health outcomes within the NHS system are broadly similar between those who have no money and those who are wealthy. Whereas in the legal system, the outcomes are so vastly different that you have to massively invest in the publicly funded legal aid system. Otherwise, you're just going to drift further and further apart. But it is undoubtedly much easier for a rich person to be found not guilty of an alleged crime than for a poor person on the same evidence. That's just a cast iron, stone cold fact.
So why do you think legal aid has been cut? Is it sort of a social aspect of it, like people don't want their money, going towards people who may be criminals? Is it a cost-saving method? They didn't have a lot of money, so they wanted to cut spending, and this was an area which expended the least political capital. What are your views on why?
Yeah, well, you've hit the nail on the head. It's exactly as you've described. When the first rounds of austerity cuts came in, the justice budget was cut by the most. It got a 40% real terms overall cut. More than any other department, because nobody gives a toss about justice, and the public are actually quite happy to see it being cut. And so a politician is going to win political capital by cutting justice spending, even though much of that spending was also cut from the police service, and huge numbers of police officers were dispensed with, and now they're trying to re-recruit them back again. But no, you're right. Political capital is something that politicians obviously preserve jealously. And when they are faced with a choice between supporting a cut to the NHS and supporting a cut to the justice budget and the courts and the prisons, they'll always want to cut the justice budget first, because politically it's almost impossible for them to defend doing anything different. So it's all about the politics. It's all about what people are prepared to vote for. So one of the reasons I've written the book, and the reason I'm doing interviews like this, is because I want to, let the public know that every time you tick a box or cross a box to vote for a candidate who wants to lock people up for longer, you're making it more likely you will get robbed or burgled. So if you're comfortable with that, you vote for them. But if you're not, then have a read of the book and have a think about it, and perhaps ask yourself, is there a politician out there who's prepared to look at things in a different way, who's prepared to advocate reform which will reduce the likelihood of you being a victim, of your children being shot in the street? Because the current model makes more people get shot in the street, and it's as simple as that.
So while we're speaking about politicians and politics, so you portray a negative attitude to the tough on crime mantra within your book, and it seems like you're opposed to this mantra that's so often repeated in political discourse, and you cite Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, who are the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, as people who expend these views. So if you could speak to Boris Johnson and Priti Patel and try to convince them that this tough on crime mantra is counterproductive, what would you say to them?
Do you know what? They know that already. I don't think I need to persuade them of that. They know that it's counterproductive in practice in terms of the outcomes in the criminal justice system, but they couldn't care less because they just want votes. And they got votes by saying what they said. Priti Patel was saying, I want criminals to quake in fear at the thought of being caught. And Boris Johnson, well, let's build more prisons. I don't care if we haven't got enough prisons, let's build more of them. So, and they say these things and people clap and people vote for those ideas. So if I were to sit down with them, I think I'd be wasting my breath because I'd be telling them stuff they already know. But politicians are cynical, aren't they? And cynical politicians will go for the vote every time over the evidence as to what works and doesn't work. And I get that to some extent, because if you do things that just because they're right, even when they're really unpopular, you're unlikely to ever win office. So I get the compromise, but I think it would be nice if maybe they were to use some of the language that they use, but once they're in office, start doing things that actually work. But the idea that I'd convince Boris Johnson or Priti Patel to do anything different, I mean, it's laughable. I mean, they're a pair of two of the least able, least rational, least sensible politicians that have had such important positions in my lifetime. I can never remember a less competent pair of Prime Minister and Home Secretary at the same time. So I think I'd be wasting my breath, to be honest with you. Just have to wait until they've gone.
These politicians, like Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, you've listed those as people who expose the views of a tough on crime approach to criminal justice, because that's where the votes are. So why do you think the votes are in the favour of a tough on crime mantra rather than a reform agenda?
I think it goes back to early kind of human experiences and human motivations. And I guess there's an element in sort of prehistoric societies where, revenge, and if someone did some harm to you, they took your chicken or whatever it was, that, you had to crack down on it to protect your property, to protect your territory. And so I think that I get that that's the mindset. But just as in, Roman times, they believed in slavery, they believed in all sorts of things. Women had no civil rights. Just because we've had something for a long time, and in this case, that tough on crime, bread and water, lock them up. I mean, in Victorian times, I talk about the treadmills that they used to have in prisons, that people used to just go round and round for all day, just, treading air, basically. All of that kind of physical toughness. That the instinct we have to punish is a really strong one. But in modern society, it also is a way of doing things that has the exact opposite effect to that which we intend. So we punish for longer and longer periods in prison, and yet we produce more and more violent crime and more recidivism and repeat criminals coming in and out. So I think it's understandable, but it goes back to the same point I made earlier. The fact that people believe something so strongly, even though it's against all of the evidence, tells someone like me that I just need to communicate better, make the argument, keep repeating it in across the different channels that I have available to me. And then, who knows, at some point perhaps in my lifetime or maybe in yours, there'll be a tipping point, and public opinion will turn in favour of the more progressive models of Norway and other countries where the criminal justice systems are quite small, and where the prison estate is very small. They lock up a small number of people for a relatively short period of time, And when they come out, most of them don't reoffend. Whereas our system is the exact opposite way around.
So within your book, you quote a conversation you had, with a criminal you may be working with, and you said, "Truth is, Chris, I'm happy in here, in prison. This is my life. I know how everything works. Everyone knows me. I can get along fine. Out there, I just can't cope." Later in the book, you write, "For those convicted of a crime and imprisoned in Norway, the reoffending rate is barely 20%, and in the US, it reaches a staggering 75%. So I think people may instinctively identify prisons in Norway as maybe holiday camps, compared to ours, which may be more tough. And people may think that, having more tough prison systems is a just approach to tackling crime. So why do you think this mentality is wrong?
Well, because the outcomes are so obviously much more successful in the Norwegian model. They're not holiday camps, they're residential communities. They're secure residential communities. So people do live in relatively normal conditions, in housing blocks, with kitchens to cook in. They don't have bars on their windows. They do have external perimeter security to keep people in, which is the most important thing in a custodial environment, is security. Not that you intimidate people with the atmosphere, with the walls, with the barbed wire, with the bars, with the clanging gates and everything everywhere. All you do with that, as you described, the character, he was a former client of mine, his name was changed, but in the book he's called Mike, and I talk about his journey and his commission of really stupid crimes just to get himself locked up again. He's prime example of why it doesn't work. He was in all of those prison environments that we have, in Victorian jails like 𝙒𝙑𝙤𝙪𝙧𝙘 in Manchester for years and years and years, and yet he just keeps coming out committing more crime. So if he were in a Norwegian style environment and had gone into such an environment in his 20s or whenever he was first in custody, I think it was in his 20s or late teens, the chances are he would have sorted himself out and wouldn't have done 30 years and wouldn't have cost us several million quid in prison costs and law enforcement and criminal justice costs. And so that's the argument is that prison in its current form as we use it in the UK makes more criminals. They are universities of crime, they are warehouses for criminals. And if people are comfortable with that as the way we do things, then keep voting for it and you'll get more criminals and more crime.
So just as a final question, on the topic of racism in the justice system, we touched on this briefly earlier. So you write that an inquiry into 𝙒𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙦 death heard that some of the officers at 𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙤 had engaged in a practice known as gladiator or Colosseum, in which black or ethnic minority inmates were deliberately placed with known racists. And it was said the bets were placed on how soon violence would erupt in the cell. So do you think there is systematic racism in the justice system? And if so, how can you make amends for these?
I think there is. I would call it probably systemic rather than systematic. I think because that implies that individual prison officers are, coming to work in the morning with the intent to be racist, and that was a particularly appalling example that I described in the book there, and does go back some years. But I think that there is systemic racism. So racism is built in. And so if you focus your law enforcement activity in urban environments and the number of stop and searches and arrests in urban environments is that much higher than it is in rural, largely white communities, then by definition, younger black men in particular and minority ethnic community young men in particular are likely to be arrested more, and they are. They're likely to be stopped and searched more, and they are. And of course, as a result, they're likely to be criminalised more, and they're likely to be prosecuted and locked up more. So as a result of that kind of completely unequal enforcement across the country in terms of law enforcement activity and arrests and prosecutions, you end up with a systemically racist outcome. You end up that the system, has many, many more black people in custody, many more people from other ethnic minorities in custody than white people. So that doesn't mean that police officers are all getting up in the morning and deciding I'm going to go and arrest a load of black people. I think most police officers day to day try to do their job very fairly and without a kind of deliberately racist intent. And I think it's just, the fact is, if you police Hackney more aggressively than you police Dorset, you're going to arrest loads more black kids. So, and particularly if you are prioritising drug crimes, particularly low-level drug crimes like cannabis possession or simple possession of certain drugs, you are going to criminalise a lot more black people than white people, and that is just wrong. You either criminalise everyone and lock 500,000 people up for drugs and all the other kind of low-level stuff that enters the criminal justice system, or you say no, we're not doing that anymore. And I'm saying we don't do that anymore.
Well, thank you for answering that question. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our discussion.
Can I just mention a couple of things before we go?
Yeah, feel free.
So I know a lot of young people watch your podcast, and I'd just like to say a lot of young lawyers in particular, if they want some sort of career advice, career tips, and all of this stuff, I did a series of videos on my YouTube channel during lockdown, which they can watch. There's a dozen or so videos about interviews and how to apply to become, solicitors or barristers, and loads of stuff like that. They can follow me on Twitter @CriminalLawUK and get loads of kind of up-to-date comment on justice issues. So, and LinkedIn, of course, I do some sort of more in-depth content and career stuff on there. So and they can still watch the TV series Crime Are We Tough Enough, which is on BBC One, and that's still on iPlayer. There's a whole range of ways in which people, if they're interested in the book, and I hope they'll buy that, obviously, and that's on Amazon, on Audible, on all the different formats. But there's loads of different ways that people can find out about some of the stuff that I'm doing, and also, it's entertainment as well. As I hope you found when you read the book. There's some juicy stuff in there, right?
Yeah, definitely. It was very interesting to read, especially how it's written through examples. It's a lot of these non-fiction books are quite dry, and it takes a long time to read.
Yeah.
I read this in a week, which is unheard of for me. So yeah, it's great that you.
Yeah.
It's great that you discuss some of the work you've done, and we'll be sure to include links to your YouTube videos, your LinkedIn, etc. In the description box of this video. So check it out if you want to learn more about Chris's work and the criminal profession more specifically. So thank you, Chris.
Fantastic. No, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it. Good interview. Well done. Good work.
Perfect.